will do their best to rectify that statement. My name is Richard Gage, AIA, a member of the American Institute of Architects. I'm a licensed architect for 22 years. I'm the founder of the nonprofit organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which came into being almost 4 years ago when I was first confronted by the piercing of the myth surrounding 9/11. Just as science finally ended a century of myth about what killed King Tut, AE 9/11 Truth is using science to end the myth of the government's official conspiracy theory about the cause of the nearly 3,000 deaths of innocent Americans on 9/11. The head of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, Zahi Hawass, told USA Today, "It's fascinating for us to try to use science to trace truth. Likewise, the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth are using science to trace truth in an historic detective story that is rivaling the search for the reality about King Tut." Well, in his book, The Ground Truth, why does John Farmer, the senior counsel for the 9/11 Commission, state that at some level of government, at some point in time, there was an agreement to not tell the truth about what happened? Well, that lack of truth is backed up by our architects and engineers with quote after quote on our website, such as from petition signer Alfred Lopez, who states, "I'm a structural engineer with 48 years of experience in all types of buildings. I agree that fire did not cause the collapse of the high-rise buildings. The most realistic cause of the collapse is that the buildings were explosively demolished." And from architect Dennis Holloway, "It was the discovery of molten steel in the debris that made me realize that something was really wrong about the mainstream media coverage of the towers." And from architect Carrie Lewis McCarthy, "It's very hard to understand the complete lack of concrete rubble in the debris field. Even had the basements filled with concrete floor slabs debris, there should have been a stack of floor elements at least 9 or more stories above grade. I haven't been able to reconcile the promoted theory of collapse with the way I know buildings to behave." Today, I'm quite pleased to announce that now we have more than 1,000 architects and engineers signed on to the AE 9/11 Truth petition, demanding of Congress a new and truly independent, unimpeachable investigation into the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. "80% of our 1,037 architects and engineers are from the U.S., and the other 20% represent 44 other countries. We hope that this number of professionals will resonate in the face of what has been a substantial quantity of ad hominem attacks such as wacky conspiracy theorists, particularly in the earlier years of 9/11, the 9/11 Truth movement. But even yesterday, Glenn Beck called us nasty, dangerous, monstrous. We don't offer conspiracy theories at AE 9/11 Truth, just scientific forensic facts whose implications, albeit, are quite disturbing. This press conference is an effort to be of service to the public in our capacity of more than 25,000 years of collective, professional, technical experience. Why are we risking our licenses, our reputations, our time, and our energy? This morning you're going to find out. We are also joined by over 30 volunteers and tens of thousands of supporters around the world. Today our supporters are holding this press conference in 31 cities, 19 states, and throughout the world in 5 other foreign countries. In the U.S., we're talking about Los Angeles, San Luis Obispo, San Diego, Santa Cruz, Sacramento, Woodland Hills, Portland, Seattle, Tucson, Las Vegas, Austin, Dallas, Denver, Chicago, Willowbrook, St. Louis, Muskogee, Bozeman, Milwaukee, Madison, Hartford, Gainesville, Tampa, Boston, Newton, Concord, Dover, Hackensack, Flemington, and Newark, New York, Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia, and overseas, Wellington, New Zealand, where the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth held their press conference already. And you can see the results here. Brussels, Lausanne, and Pulley, Switzerland, as well as Sydney, Australia. In Canada, we're in Victoria, Vancouver, St. Catharines, Hamilton, and Ontario. And we probably have more that I haven't even heard about. 14,000 supporters make a big difference in any kind of a movement where they are as dedicated as these. Our organization, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, attends architectural conventions, most recently in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia. We're educating hundreds of architects and engineers, and sharing the research systematically has resulted in new signatures in the petition and additional support for a new independent investigation. We've been interviewed by the media around the world on this topic, including several dozen interviews and articles in print, such as World Architecture News, Silicon Valley Metro, and in Japan, Asahi Shimbun, Focus Money magazine in Germany, TV appearances including the BBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, National Geographic, Fox TV, and PBS in Colorado. Over 140 radio interviews, including Coast to Coast AM, KPFA, KGO, KABC, and several aired debates with supporters of the official conspiracy theory. We presented 8 senators from Japan, the Japanese Parliament, in November, all of whom expressed support for us as well as for a new investigation. After careful examination of the official explanation of the destruction of these 3 buildings, along with the eyewitnesses' testimony and forensic data that was omitted from the official reports, we, along with other professionals in the 9/11 Truth movement, have concluded that a new independent investigation into these catastrophic events is both necessary and essential to the preservation of our democracy. Even the FBI has weighed in, citing that our work is, quote, backed by thorough research and analysis, writes Michael J. Heimbach, Assistant Director, Counterterrorism Division. So what's going on here that even the FBI can see, but the mainstream media and our other government officials cannot or will not? We will present a very brief outline of the explosive evidence compiled, after which you'll have the opportunity to have your questions answered. Following this, there will be an opportunity to interview our speakers. Please see Abby. Abby, are you here? Would you raise your hand high? Abby? Abby, come and raise your hand high. And can I see? She's out front. Bring her up, please. I want everybody to see her. More detailed information, of course, can be found in our DVD, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, The Architecture of Destruction, available on our website, AE 9/11 Truth, and provided to you in your press kits. Let's see what a typical controlled demolition looks like. Here it is. The way they do this is by placing explosives synchronistically timed floor by floor through the building so that we bring the building down symmetrically, vertically, at almost free fall acceleration, using the building's weight to do much of the destruction. So the result of a typical controlled demolition is a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint, because demolition waves remove the column supports. This results in a free fall acceleration almost, straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance. A total dismemberment of the steel structure is resulted, where it's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Minimal damage to adjacent structures is always good. Sounds and flashes of explosions are heard and seen by witnesses. We have enormous clouds of pulverized concrete, of course, from the explosives. We have squibs, or explosive isolated jets, occurring at different points in the building. And of course, we have chemical evidence in the debris pile, evidence of cutter charges. All of this is direct evidence of explosive destruction, and guess what? Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10. If we have additional supporting documentation, like government documentation, quite helpful, expert corroboration, foreknowledge, and video documentation. Foreknowledge because it takes months to plan and execute a controlled demolition. This is all proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, of controlled demolition. Do we have any of these characteristics in Building 7? Most Americans, most all architects and engineers, in fact, know nothing about the third worst structural failure in modern history. Building 7, a 47-story skyscraper, a football field away from the Twin Towers, was not hit by an airplane. And yet, at 5:20 in the afternoon, it collapses in a manner in which we'll see. We noticed that the North Tower came down, and some of the debris from it landed all the way over onto Building 7. But here it is standing through the morning and the afternoon, and it comes down at 5:20. Let's see if there's any of the characteristics of explosive controlled demolition in Building 7's destruction. Starting with, do we have a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? In the DVD that you have, you'll see plenty of witnesses that describe sounds of explosions. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate this for us.
High shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Now, Dan never repeated these words on mainstream media after that day. In fact, most of us, hardly any of us, have seen Building 7 coming down. It won't be played. Why? We'll see. Let's take another look from West Street. Smooth, symmetrical, straight down.
It's gone, man. 17 down.
Let's bring it back up. Penthouse falls 1 second before the rest of the building. I'm not quite sure. Let's take a look side by side. We have Building 7 on the left and a known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant a new investigation into the possible use of explosives? Why did not NIST... Why did NIST not look at the most obvious hypothesis? These are the fires that are said to have caused the destruction of this building. 8 to 10 fairly small, fairly scattered fires. This one on the 12th floor, which is cited as the initiation of collapse. But we have a statement from NIST in Appendix L that says they have photos that show that that building, that fire went out in that area at least an hour, hour and a half before the building collapsed. So that area was cooling already. This is a huge problem for the official story. How do we bring a building straight down into its own footprint? We have to remove the column supports, 24 of them in this case, and all of them within 1/10 of a second of each other. Any deviation in that pattern, and the building will begin to tip. The question is, can fire, especially those fires that you saw, be responsible for this level of precision? Big problem for the official story. Let's see how fast this building comes down. In just 6.5 seconds, at free fall acceleration, as fast as this piece of thermite is falling through the air, is how fast this building comes down in the first 100 feet. Free fall acceleration. The building is accelerating, getting faster and faster, straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance. How does that happen? We have to remove all those columns. And it appears that we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure. A 47-story skyscraper, moment steel frame resisting, columns, beams welded very tightly, very robustly together, collapses like a house of cards into just about 4 stories. They all had to have been cut. Sounds of explosions heard and seen by witnesses. You'll hear and see those on the DVD. Enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of concrete suspended in the air, fueled by the expansion of these gases from the extremely hot temperatures associated not with those 8 to 10 small fires, but with something else that we're going to be looking at in a moment. Racing 35 miles an hour in every direction away from the building. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. David Ray Griffin up to provide additional perspective for Dr. Griffin will bring additional perspective this morning on the questionable science of NIST. Author of The Mysterious Collapse of the World Trade Center 7, why the official report about 9/11 is unscientific and false. Dr. Griffin is a professor of philosophy of religion and theology, emeritus at Claremont School of Theology and Claremont Graduate University, the author of 36 books, 9 of which are on the subject of 9/11. His most complete statement about 9/11, The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, was Publisher Weekly's Pick of the Week in 2008. His work on the 9/11 issue has prompted his nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. David Ray Griffin.
Good morning, and thank you. I have prepared comments I will just read. A recently discovered paper on conspiracy theories by Obama appointee Cass Sunstein has rightly been receiving a lot of negative attention. But this paper also makes an important contribution, pointing out that an idea cannot be rejected simply because it is a conspiracy theory, because there are true as well as false conspiracy theories. We can decide between a true and a false theory, of course, only by examining the evidence. Sunstein says that the government's 9/11 conspiracy theory, according to which the attacks came about because of a conspiracy between Osama bin Laden and 19 members of Al-Qaeda, is true, while the theory of the 9/11 truth movement is false. Do we need to fix the microphone? People seem to be telling me. Does somebody want to do it, or? Well, yeah, it seemed like it went off there at some point. Okay, thank you. Sunstein says that the government's 9/11 conspiracy theory, according to which the 9/11 attacks resulted from a conspiracy between Osama bin Laden and 19 members of his Al-Qaeda organization, is true, while that of the 9/11 truth movement is false. But he provides no evidence for either claim. The 9/11 truth movement, however, has presented an enormous amount of evidence to support its claims. For example, in my 2009 book, The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7, I have shown that the report on this collapse put out by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is unscientific and false. It is unscientific because it can make its major negative claim that the building was not brought down by explosives only by ignoring multiple testimonies about explosions going off in the building, by ignoring a piece of steel from the building that looked like a piece of Swiss cheese, even though fire could not have gotten anywhere close to the temperature needed to melt steel. By ignoring particles of metals in the dust that could have been produced only by extremely high temperatures, and by ignoring the existence of nanothermite, a high explosive. The NIST report is also unscientific because it can make its major positive claim that the building was brought down by fire only by telling rather obvious lies. For example, that a huge fire was burning on the 12th floor at 5 p.m., even though in its 2004 interim report, NIST had a photograph showing this fire to be completely burned out by 4:45, and that the building collapsed because its girders were not connected to the floor slabs with shear studs, even though that same 2004 report indicated that the girders were connected with shear studs. The NIST study is unscientific, finally, because it affirms a miracle in the sense of a violation of basic principles of physics. Only months before NIST put out its final report, its lead investigator, Shyam Sunder, correctly stated that free fall would have been physically impossible in a fire-produced collapse. But after high school physics teacher David Chandler demonstrated in a YouTube presentation that the building came down in absolute free fall for over 2 seconds, NIST affirmed this empirical fact while still maintaining its fire theory of the collapse. It therefore affirmed what it had previously acknowledged to be impossible. The government's theory about the collapse of World Trade Center 7 has therefore been disproved as thoroughly as any theory could be. This is one of the reasons why 1,000 licensed architects and engineers are calling for a new investigation. And let me add that this is a big week for 9/11 Truth. Just this week, 6 major stories have appeared in the Danish press based on interviews with Professor Niels Harrit of the University of Copenhagen's chemistry department, who was the lead author of the paper on nanothermite that Stephen Jones' group had initiated. And so the story is getting a major coverage in a European country, none in the United States thus far. Secondly, a symposium has just appeared in a major American social science journal called the American Behavioral Sciences. It is now online. This symposium is about what they call SCADs, State Crimes Against Democracy. The book begins by saying, the symposium begins by saying, the silence of due diligence regarding the official account of the 9/11 incidents continued being ignored by scholars of policy and public administration. This symposium also takes aim at the use of the term conspiracy theories to silence all criticisms about crimes originating from people in high places. And finally, I'll talk more about it this afternoon at the luncheon, but it talks about the incredible silence of the Academy in response to what happened to Professor Stephen Jones of Brigham University, who was forced out of his position simply because he wrote a scientific paper that disagreed with the government's interpretation of the World Trade Center collapses. Normally, this would cause an enormous row within the Academy. They said, aside from a peep from the AAUP, there was virtual silence. Thank you very much.
Doctor?
No questions.
Were there pools of molten iron and or steel in the debris of the Twin Towers and Building 7. This section applies to both. Here we see pouring out of the South Tower just minutes before its collapse, molten metal by any standard. The official story tells us that this must be molten aluminum from the melted airplane. But molten aluminum looks like molten aluminum. It's silvery, does not glow bright orange and yellow in daylight conditions. Must be molten iron or molten steel. Who says this? As of 21 days after the attack, fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. This is attributed to Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself. And his associate, Richard Garlock, who says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, saw pools of literally molten steel, says the lead contractor, the president of the company. And what do these gentlemen say?
Get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah. Like lava.
Like lava.
Like lava from a volcano. Well, the problem with all of this is that the fires and jet fuel, for that matter, which is a hydrocarbon, burns only at about 12, maybe 1,400 degrees under ideal fuel-air mixture ratios. Molten metal, molten steel, molten iron doesn't begin to even be produced until over 2,700 degrees, more than twice that temperature. What could possibly account for these extreme hot temperatures? We'll be looking at thermite, a likely suspect, which produces hot molten iron at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll see what thermite is exactly. It's used to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Do we have evidence, though, of thermite in the molten metal? Well, let's see what thermite is, first of all.
Incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, this is very interesting. It turns out that there's chemical analysis performed on this previously molten metal. This chunk, for instance, a piece of which was sent to Dr. Stephen Jones, whom we'll be hearing from shortly, and he finds that this is predominantly iron. So he rules out aluminum from the jet plane, and it has abundant manganese. So he rules out structural steel as a major component. So it's not melted steel. Where does iron come from? Iron is a part of structural steel, but this is not that. It came from some other source. We don't use iron anymore in building materials, and it has manganese and fluorine in abundance. This is quite peculiar because manganese is from the potassium permanganate, which is commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. And fluorine is used primarily in sol-gel type thermite charges. These together are the fingerprint of thermite. But what about all of that dust? Laid throughout lower Manhattan, 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to a fine powder, laid in a blanket 4 to 12 inches thick. Here's some here. It was sent to Dr. Jones, 4 separate samples, one across the street in an apartment, one on top of the skyscraper 2 to 3 blocks away, another one collected just 10 minutes after the collapse on the Brooklyn Bridge. What is so interesting about this? What do they find? Well, in all of the dust samples, not only the teams of scientists find these, but R.J. Lee, an environmental consultant, and USGS find billions of these spheres. Well, how did they get there? And they're iron, interestingly enough. So they're previously molten. Well, if there were thousands of thermite cutter charges placed throughout the columns and beams in the buildings, and under explosive conditions, it would disperse that thermite, not dissimilar from the spray out of a bottle where its liquid is atomized. It forms itself into a sphere by surface tension. Then it falls and cools and lands with all of the dust. This is the only rational explanation for the billions of these spheres found in the samples. So, Dr. Jones does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on the spheres, and he determines that they're curiously similar to ignited thermite from a controlled experiment. Again, USGS finds these spheres. They're iron. R.J. Lee finds them. They're iron. They're about the width of a human hair, very tiny spheres. So Dr. Jones concludes that given the trace metals mixed in here, it's clear that it's a significant evidence for aluminothermic reactions. Furthermore, he takes the next step that no one had taken, and he asks himself, what would have been in the original recipe, if you will, the chemical makeup of unignited thermite? And would you find any of that in the dust? Well, we'd be looking for powders of aluminum, iron oxide, copper oxide, and other materials. And guess what? He found it. I'd like to introduce you to one of the chief scientists on the international team who continues his investigation into the World Trade Center dust, Dr. Stephen E. Jones, Emeritus Professor of Physics. Dr. Jones has published over 50 peer-reviewed scientific papers in established journals, including Scientific American and Nature. His PhD research was conducted at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Dr. Stephen Jones.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Richard. Richard is quite a spokesman, I must say. He's wonderful, and I'm very glad to be here. If I can get my Apple to work here today for us. As Richard said, let's see, do I need to try this one more time? I'll do this one more time here. Sometimes in the transition. Okay. Sometimes in the transition to another computer, there's just a little time element here. It should be there, though. Mook, do you have that? Nope. The projector is the... Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Wow, Richard has just summarized. Mook wants me to take a little time here. Okay, I will follow the guidance of man filming things. Let me say, while they're getting that projector warmed up, yes. Okay, as I've described these results to scientists around the world, I had one scientist in America who told me, he said, you know, these results from a scientific point of view are very exciting. It's quite an adventure to see this, these data come together and support this hypothesis of controlled demolition. He said, it's remarkable. I mean, it was such a hypothesis. It seems so far-fetched, and yet all the evidence is lining up. As he looked at it, and he agreed that the case was compelling for controlled demolition. Then he said, but I'm sad for my country, you see. And this is certainly an important issue. Still having trouble with the projector? Maybe I'll just, okay. Let me just talk a little bit about my involvement and how I got started, which was in 2005, in April of, oh, we're starting to get it, great. And it was with the collapse of World Trade Center 7 that Richard has talked about, and David, and I appreciate their eloquence. Now we have slides that we can look at. These are photographs through a microscope of these amazing red-gray chips that we found in the World Trade Center dust. We all saw that dust, this voluminous dust. Well, in the dust there are large numbers of these chips that looked like this red material. Initially I thought, or early on, I thought that this might be paint chips, so I'll talk about that in a moment. We looked and analyzed very carefully 4 independently collected samples. The chain of custody is very well established, as described in our paper. In addition to what is in our peer-reviewed paper on the chain of custody question, we also have videotapes of the persons collecting this, testifying how they collected it, where they collected it, when they collected it, and how it came to the scientists on our team, not just to me, but to other scientists as well. These chips are seen in all 4 of these samples, and you see the pictures here from our paper. We did a consistency check, of course, and analyzed the elements present. It's actually a fairly simple structure in this red material, but a very important structure as you look at the chemical signature, which involves iron and oxygen, as well as aluminum and carbon. And notice there, well, I don't know if, there's no zinc in evidence. That becomes important in a moment. But this question, perhaps there's a prosaic explanation for these chips. Perhaps it is just paint, and in particular primer paint, which was applied to the World Trade Center steel, which has a red-orange color, similar to the color that we see here. So we finally found a sample of the primer paint. Now, as most of you know, over 99% of the steel in the World Trade Center buildings was quickly shipped to Asia and melted. It was recycled. This evidence from a crime scene was destroyed. Over the objection of many scientists and engineers, now, nevertheless, some of the steel has been preserved in memorials. This particular memorial is at Clarkson University in New York State. The fellow that put the monument together for the university was kind enough to go to the monument and extract some of the paint off the surface. So this is actual primer paint then from the World Trade Center. And what we have is the analysis of the paint on the bottom plot, and for comparison, the analysis, the chemical, the elemental signature for the red chip material on the top plot. And you can see that they are distinctly different. The paint shows a very strong signal of zinc. There is no zinc in the red chip material. There are other differences that you can see. The calcium peak is enormous in the paint, for example. Now, when we look at the red material, this anomalous, now I can call it anomalous because it doesn't behave like paint, certainly very distinct from the primer paint actually used in the World Trade Center. So now we use a scanning electron microscope to get this remarkable image that appears in our paper, showing faceted grains of iron oxide and aluminum in the plates. If you look towards the center of this picture, you can see both plates and these faceted grains. And the gray material, it looks gray actually on this image from the electron microscope, is an organic. And, you know, I have people say, well, maybe the buildings collapsed and then somehow you just form this nanothermite material. Well, it turns out to be quite a bit more complicated than that because of the very ultra-fine, this is at 50,000 power, we can finally see the plate-like structures containing aluminum and the faceted grains that are also very tiny, about 100 nanometers across. This is nanoscale. It's just hard to comprehend how difficult it is to reach that scale. And notice the uniformity, if you can see then, in the faceted iron oxide grains. Anyway, then you've got the organic mix, and my reaction as soon as someone says, well, maybe the buildings just fell, and you know, you've got iron oxide, which is rust, I agree, and aluminum in the buildings, and they come together and form nanothermite. My question is, yeah, well, where does all the organic material come from, and how do you get these all formed intimately combined in this mixture, and to get it to react rapidly as it does. In this plot, which is described in more detail in our paper, the blue curve shows the reaction of the red material from the World Trade Center. We did this with from all 4 samples. This is one of the samples. Notice that it goes to a high peak there in watts per gram. The red peak is from known nanothermite. This is from a paper published by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, scientists there, which is just down the street, basically, here, not too far away. And this is a 2001 paper, meaning that they had worked on this, of course, for years prior to this. Both of these curves show a very high energy release in short times. And in fact, the red material from the World Trade Center, 7 years later, when we did the test, reacts more rapidly than known nanothermite. It's a very remarkable stuff. In the words of my colleague, Dr. Fair, it blows up. And this is from the World Trade Center dust. It still blows up. Following the tests, these ignition tests in the DSC, we looked at the residue and we observed numerous iron-rich spheres, which Richard talked about, and so prevalent in the dust. Now, these spheres were not present in the red material prior to ignition, but following ignition, they are present. This means, it doesn't just suggest, it means that there were very high temperatures present. And furthermore, we find iron oxide beforehand. I'll show you data on that in a moment. And we find elemental iron, that is, not enough oxygen to produce iron oxide after ignition. That means the iron is reduced in chemical terms, which means there was a thermite reaction. I know of no other way to reduce the iron and produce these spheres from this material as we have observed and published in a peer-reviewed paper. Now here's some new data. Here are some new data. Transmission electron microscope data showing in the circle one of our iron oxide grains. The scale here is 100 nanometers, lower left-hand corner. So these are indeed very ultra-fine grains. We then look at the TEM electron diffraction pattern for this grain that was circled, and we see a very clear diffraction pattern, the bright points that you see here. By analyzing the lattice structure that is denoted by this electron diffraction pattern, comparing with known elements. So here in this table, Dr. Fair is comparing the D-spacing in angstroms, second column, with the D-spacing in angstroms of iron oxide, Fe2O3. And we find a match, an exact match, showing that Fe2O3 is indeed a component of this red material from the World Trade Center dust and these ultrafine grains. And by the way, no elemental iron was found. It is present after the reaction. That's what you expect from the thermitic reaction, the production of iron from iron oxide. what happens is that the oxygen associated with the iron oxide transfers over, is taken by the aluminum so that you form elemental iron. It's very vigorous reaction, of course. My last slide. This is our paper. Dr. Niels Herret is first author, and he's doing a wonderful job of spreading the information about this science. This is a peer-reviewed paper in an established scientific journal. I want to emphasize that this paper has not yet been challenged in the literature, the peer-reviewed literature. In the protocol of science, the established protocol, we have published our findings. It took months to get this through peer review, I might say, but it has been published. And as David Griffin pointed out, it's receiving a great deal of attention in Europe. We're hoping, beginning with this conference, we'll get some attention in the media in the United States. Thank you.
Richard, I'm hoping you will please accept this six-hour
Please.
interview with
Thank you.
Anderson, former chief of the Los Angeles FBI.
Thank you very much.
Clarifying the connection.
We'll go on now. You can receive the active thermitic materials paper in the lobby for a very small donation. So Dr. Jones and his small team of scientists have published this paper, and it is taking scientific circles by storm. Now, all of this evidence together points toward the World Trade Center in Building 7. It's all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Now, interestingly enough, fire can't account for any one of these 10 key characteristics, let alone all 10 of them. Not only that, we have FEMA documenting in the Appendix C of their BPAT report in May of 2002 the melting of steel. Again, fires can't melt steel, turning a solid girder into Swiss cheese like this piece here. Interestingly enough, this is only one of 2 pieces of steel that were saved from the 40,000 tons of steel in World Trade Center 7. It was all, the rest of it was removed illegally, the destruction of evidence, before the report came out saying, hey, we don't know how this building came down. Our best hypothesis, fire, has only a low probability of occurrence. Let's look at the steel and see what happened. But it was all shipped to China by that time. Expert corroboration? Well, here's one of many. Danny Juwenko, top European controlled demolitions expert, 27 years. He says it starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. Do we have foreknowledge of the destruction? Plenty, and you'll see it in your DVD, but here's a sneak preview. Listen to these mysterious construction workers.
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
This building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys?
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
Flame and debris coming down, the building's about to blow up. How do they know that these 8 to 10 small fires are about to blow up the building? What's going on here? Well, you'll see that all of this all of this direct evidence, along with data from the FEMA reports, whistleblowers, which you'll hear about in the DVD, the expert corroboration, foreknowledge of destruction, this is proof beyond a reasonable doubt of explosive controlled demolition. And I'm going to show you now the problems associated with the Twin Towers, because as clear as that evidence is for World Trade Center Building 7, the Twin Towers have even a far greater clarity in the evidence associated. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base, not at the base, but at the point of jet plane impacts? After all, let's realize now we're looking at deceptive controlled demolitions. We want to blame the collapse of this building on the fires and the planes we're going to start these explosions, in this case, at the point of jet plane impacts. Whereupon we hear, and we will hear several examples, dozens and dozens and dozens in the DVD, of sounds and flashes of explosions heard and seen by witnesses, like these, 100 of them, recorded in October after 9/11, but we didn't know about this until August of 2005. Why? The city was holding this information. Finally, the New York Court State of Appeals required them to turn it over to the New York Times. What are these guys saying? 100 of them. Over 100. It actually shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash, and then it kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Well, let's see what they might be talking about as we see a known controlled demolition on the left and the North Tower on the right. Is there any similarity in the upper part of the North Tower to a known controlled demolition? Enough to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, perhaps. That's when I saw the building coming down. Pop, pop, pop. I heard that frigging noise. I saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. You actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. Each popping sound initially in orange, and then a red flash came out of the building. And then it would go around the building on all four sides. Let's look at the South Tower, see if there's any similarity to a known controlled demolition occurring on the left, where the demolition sequence is occurring in the middle of the building. They don't always have to start at the bottom. I saw a flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Let's listen to these gentlemen.
Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was like, it was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
At this time, I would like to introduce to you a very special gentleman and friend of mine, a firefighter and paramedic of 22 years and founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, claiming now 116 firefighters on the petition, Mr. Eric Lawyer. Thank you. Before we talk into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And like Richard said, my name is Eric Lawyer, and I founded the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth after I watched Richard in one of his presentations, and I realized that something more had to be done. And I just want to thank Richard for everything he's doing here, and the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth strongly support Richard Gage and all the architects and engineers that have the courage to sign that petition. And I know from personal experience there's about 5 times as many out there that believe what we believe but don't have the courage to sign it. So what I'm hoping today is that people will find the courage after listening to this presentation and seeing everybody here and seeing that we are behind it. We also demand an investigation that follows the national standards and has contempt and subpoena powers. 9/11 was the greatest loss of life and property damage in U.S. fire history. This should have been the most protected, preserved, over-tested, and thorough investigation of a crime scene in world history. Sadly, it was not. What was it? Well, we know from their own admission, the majority of the evidence was destroyed. Like Richard said, 22 years of experience, I've seen a lot of crime scenes. I've never seen anything like this in my life. I was out at the site. I saw trucks leaving faster than anywhere I've ever seen, but I accepted it at the time, and for years I accepted it because it was a recovery and rescue operation, and that's normal to have something like that going. Again, we'd never seen anything like it, but that was expected. What I didn't know for years, what was going on behind the scenes, was that evidence was being destroyed when it was shipped off. By their own admission, Tower 7 investigation, this investigation at Tower 7 had no physical evidence. How do you investigate a crime when you've destroyed all the evidence? It doesn't make sense. They also admit that they refused to test the explosives, or to test for explosives or residue of thermite. Now, this is what I'm going to go into here just real quickly, is there are national standards for an investigation. That's what all of us are asking for, an investigation that follows national standards and holds people accountable. This manual right here, just so you can see it, what we'd call the kind of the Fire Investigation 101. This is the most basic fire investigation manual there. This is for the 2001 edition. This is what should have been referred to, at least. It doesn't have to be followed exactly, but it should have been used as a guideline for the investigation. I'm just going to cover a few of the things that are in here. So NIST violated, and the initial investigators that did not protect the scene violated the most basic of the guidelines. And I'm going to cover 5 of them here. One is the NFPA 9.3.6. It covers spoliation of evidence. Specifically what it reads is, once evidence has been removed from the scene, it should be maintained and not destroyed or altered until the investigation is complete. The steel was melted down prior to the investigation. We know that from their own admission. This is no conspiracy theory stuff. 19.2.4, exotic accelerants. If on the scene you find melted steel or concrete, you should consider the use of exotic accelerants. And they specifically say in the manual, thermite mixtures produce exceedingly hot fires that can account for melted steel and concrete. That also says they leave residues that can be tested for visually and chemically identifiable. Again, they did not test for it. And just put it in perspective, on a routine house fire, if we suspect even the slightest use of an accelerant, we're going to test for it when there's no fatalities, when there's very little property damage. So to not do it on this, there is absolutely no excuse. I can't drive that point home enough. 18.15 is analyze fuel source. All available fuel sources should be considered and eliminated until one fuel can be identified as meeting all the physical damage criteria. For example, if you find pulverized concrete, which we all know there was in all 3 buildings, there was pulverized concrete, the only fuels that can create seeded explosions should be considered. So they shouldn't be considering fires. They shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't account for pulverized concrete. They should only be considering exotic accelerants and explosives. 19.4.8.2.6, extremism. The terrorist may include fire as but one of a variety of weapons along with explosives used in furthering his or her goal. We know they used them in '93. Why would we not test for them now? There was reports that day, multiple reports, which I'll get into here in a second. So they could have put them in the basement. How do we know that unless we test for it? I mean, even if it is the terrorists that they claim they are, we need to test this. 14.3, preservation of the fire scene and physical evidence. We find the following. The cause of a fire explosion is not known until near the end of the investigation. The entire fire scene should be considered physical evidence and should be protected and preserved. It's just over and over. There's so many. You can go to our website, the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. We have many more of these actual chapters that cover what they should have done that they did not do. So now, by their own admission, in all 3 building collapses, NIST refused to physically test, like Dr. Stephen Jones did, for explosives. This is just unbelievable. And here are their excuses, and I quote, "It is unlikely that 100 pounds of thermite or more could have been carried into World Trade Center 7 and placed around columns without being detected, either prior to September 11th or during that day." So again, I've been on a lot of fire scenes, and I've seen a lot of investigations, and why would we not test because something's hard to do? That's the exact reason you need to investigate it. If that was hard to do, we need to find out how they did it. And number 2, NIST excuse. In addition, no blast sounds were heard on the audio tracks of the video recordings during the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or reported by witnesses. That's one of their excuses why they didn't test. Well, apparently they didn't read Chapter 18. 18 is the general definition of explosions. Although an explosion is almost always accompanied by the production of a loud noise, the noise itself is not, in big bold letters, an essential element in the definition of an explosion. The generation and violent escape of gases are the primary criteria of an explosion. So that alone says they should have tested for it. But then we also, NIST has lied, and we can prove it. As soon as the new investigation happens, the evidence is out there for you to see right now. We have 118 first responders who reported explosions. We have the radio transmissions from FDNY members that are still recorded today that reported explosions. We have audio recordings. We have video recordings. I've personally talked to witnesses that heard them. So there's nothing short of saying they lied, and they need to be held accountable. And besides that, like I said, there is no excuse for not testing for explosives. And so at the very least, at the very best, even if you want to believe the official story, this was the most incompetent investigation of all time. And I've talked to a lot of investigators that were there, and I asked them the specific question, why did they refuse to test? They weren't the ones who refused, but NIST did. And they said, all they can answer is incompetence, or they tell me to shut up. They cannot give me any reason that follows national standards. So, but the reality, after all the research everybody here and the incredible people we're in the room with today have done, the reality is it was a criminal investigation to cover up the crime. So I'd like, just to finish, I'd like to read a quote. This is from a retired decorated FDNY lieutenant. Anyone who knows the fire service, he is a stud. He worked on Ladder Company 26, Rescue Company 3, Rescue Company 1 in his career. Anyone who knows, those are amazing companies. Here's his comment. Trade Tower 7 by itself is the smoking gun. Not hit by an aircraft with only a few relatively small fires, it came down in a classic crimp and implosion, going straight into its basement. Something only very precise demolitions can accomplish, which takes days, if not weeks, to prepare. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention it, and FEMA actually stated they didn't know why it collapsed and left it at that. Brothers, I know that the above implications are hard, almost unthinkable, but the official explanation is utter nonsense, and 343 of our murdered brothers are crying out for justice. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Eric Lawyer, Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. My God, where will it end? Look at the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with symmetry, upward, outward, arching streamers, pyroclastic-like clouds of dust. Compare these known explosions on the right to the development of the collapse of the North Tower. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant a new investigation into the possible use of explosives? Look at the North Tower as it develops its descent. We see two explosions up at the top immediately, and then we see the telescoping of the North Tower, the destruction of the upper 15 stories before there's any crushing of the lower story, the lower block by that upper block. Look again. And belts of explosions like the firemen described, wrapping all the way around the building in tremendous display of pyroclastic-like dust. Look again as we stop and start on the North Tower. Like the firemen said, belts of explosions, symmetry, even lines. Asymmetry from fires and asymmetry from jet plane impacts do not produce symmetry like engineered destructions. Take a look from below the canopy of destruction. We have a series of very violent explosions as we'll zoom in here underneath, not to mention the lateral distribution of debris. Take a look now. Violent explosions here, here, here. Isolated ejections of pulverized building materials. Look down here, racing down the corner of the building. As fast almost as the debris falling alongside. This is almost free fall acceleration. It turns out to be 2/3 of free fall acceleration. This is anything but a gravitational collapse mechanism. Do we have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint? FEMA shows us a 1,200-foot diameter of debris, almost equally displaced outside the footprint of the building, well beyond the boundaries of ground zero. Here's Building 7, a nice, neat implosion, classic controlled demolition. Here's the very explosive event known as the destruction of the Twin Towers. Take a look at these pulverized building materials, which we're told by NIST are puffs of air being produced by this pile driver. Well, first of all, there's no pile driver. It's destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds. These are not puffs of air. They're pulverized building materials ejected at 160 to 200 feet per second. These are at explosive speeds. And they're 20, 40, and even 60 stories down below. And they are extremely precise at the midpoints between the corners of the buildings. Do we have a near free fall pace through the path of greatest resistance? Indeed, it turns out to be 2/3 of free fall. There is no jolt. This building does not stop while it's crushing thousands of tons of steel underneath. It starts immediately, suddenly, smoothly, and without interruption, straight down. This indicates that there is no resistance, or extremely little resistance, from the structure below. Do we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure? Well, watch as the South Tower is destroying itself and disappearing into this cloud. What we would expect is this tilting mass to fall in some mangled heap down at the bottom of the ground, and yet it disappears into this dust cloud. At 22 degrees, it's off-center of the building below. How can it crush the building below at any rate when it is falling off and continuing its angular momentum, theoretically? We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, and asymmetrical loading from the building above. Watch what's happening below. Complete symmetrical destruction, like the firemen described, bands of explosions, pop, 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 all the way down the building at 2/3 of free fall speed. It is a complete non sequitur and a complete distribution, an equal distribution of debris, where the steel frame skeleton is almost completely broken up. How about the lateral ejection of steel? 9-ton perimeter wall units, most of them ejected 50 to 70 miles an hour, instant acceleration, speed, outside of the perimeter walls, landing up to 600 feet away. This requires an enormous amount of energy and lateral energy. How about the floors? We had 110 floors in each of these twin towers, each an acre in size, 4 and 5-inch thick concrete laid over 22-gauge metal decking. How many of these floors do we find at the bottom of this gravitational collapse? Not 50, not 10, not 1. The debris shows only core columns, perimeter columns, aluminum cladding. Where did the pancakes go in this pancaking collapse? We're looking for pancakes like these in a traditional pancaking collapse. Do we have enormous clouds of pyroclastic concrete? Well, where did the concrete go? All we see in the remains is dust and steel. Direct evidence of explosive destruction. Again, fire can't create any one of these. And how about that NIST report? We were told that this is the answer in 2005 as to how the Twin Towers collapsed. But the entire $20 million 3-year effort by NIST stops at the initiation of collapse. I am not kidding you. Their objective, it doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Why not? Structural engineers do this for a living, calculate the ability of the structure below to resist any impacting mass from above. Had they gone any farther in their analysis, they would have had to have accounted for all of the evidence for explosive controlled demolition that begins at that point. They had to stop there. They had no choice. What do they call this? The final report on the collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. There is no analysis on the collapse whatsoever. It is a complete Potemkin village designed to explain something that it doesn't even begin to do. And they acknowledge that. In our request for correction, they acknowledge we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of this building. They have 1/2 page which speculates that after the initiation of collapse, what we have is global collapse ensuing. Well, the videos showed that. Essentially came down at free fall acceleration. They acknowledge that too. Interesting, prompting their own chief science division, Dr. James Quintier, to look at real alternatives that might have been the cause of the collapse of the Twin Towers. He quit. Do we have expert corroboration? Plenty. Here's William Rice, who states, as many of our 30 structural engineers with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth state, the interesting fact is that each of these 110-story Twin Towers fell upon itself in about 10 seconds at near free fall acceleration. This violates Newton's law of conservation of momentum that would require that the stationary inertia of each floor is overcome by being hit. The mass increases and the free fall acceleration decreases. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. I would submit that this is all direct evidence. Again, for explosive destruction, fire can't even create one of these, let alone all 10 of them, along with additional testimony, which you'll see in the DVD, whistleblowers, expert corroboration, foreknowledge, also with the Twin Towers. This is proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, of destruction by explosive controlled demolition. So we have some very serious problems with NIST. In fact, let's summarize our chief concerns about the veracity of these reports. NIST lied about the severity, the fire severity and duration in all 3 skyscrapers. NIST lied about the evidence of molten iron and steel in the rubble. NIST refused to test for explosives when explosive demolition was the most likely hypothesis. NIST and FEMA would not follow the NFPA guidelines for fire and explosion investigation, looking for explosives in the residue. NIST will not release the computer model and input data due to Freedom of Information Requests Acts, claiming that its release would jeopardize public safety. NIST ejected the FEMA Appendix C documentation and photos of melted steel beams. NIST's animated computer model bears no resemblance to the actual collapse as seen in the videos of World Trade Center 7. In the Twin Towers, NIST claims that the upper block above the point of jet plane impacts of each of the Twin Towers crushed the lower block, but video analysis reveals clearly that the upper block disintegrated in waves of explosions prior to any crushing of the lower block. NIST's technical analysis into the Twin Towers collapse stops at initiation of collapse. NIST acknowledges in its response to our request for correction that they are unable to provide a full explanation, or any explanation, really. NIST tests the steel assemblies of the Twin Towers in a 2-hour, 2,000-degree fire test, and they sagged only 4 inches. But NIST tossed out this experimental data, claiming a 42-inch sag. NIST's own metallographic paint analysis indicates fire temperatures of only up to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet they claim temperatures of over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. In short, NIST's official technical explanation is fraudulent and inconsistent with the basic laws of physics. By contrast, the hypothesis of controlled demolition is consistent with all of the available forensic evidence. Since the official FEMA and NIST reports provide insufficient, contradictory, and fraudulent accounts of the tower's destruction, and since we have already filed complaints in 2009 to the Office of the Inspector General, who oversees the Department of Commerce, who oversees NIST, and we've received no redress, we are now calling upon the Attorney General, Eric Holder of the United States, to impanel a federal grand jury investigation of the individuals responsible at NIST, including lead investigator Shyam Sunder and co-project leader John Gross. And today, as we speak, every member of Congress is receiving the AE 9/11 Truth Petition for a new investigation with every one of the names of the 1,000 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And this is available for you outside, again, for a small donation to help us proceed along our path, because our path is extremely important, as you're beginning to realize. After all, if the destruction of these buildings was a controlled demolition, this may be also evidence of treason. We are reminding our public officials that the misprision of treason is a federal offense committed where someone who has knowledge of the commission of any treason against the United States and does not inform the president or federal judge or state governor or judge it is punishable by a fine of up to 7 years in federal prison. The ramifications of 9/11 being some sort of an inside operation are enormous, and they may have legal reverberations throughout the hundreds of existing 9/11-based civil and criminal legal proceedings, not the least of which is the forthcoming trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. If the roots of 9/11 are in question, then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are also as well. And of course, the serious loss through legislation of our constitutionally guaranteed and cherished civil liberties via the Patriot Act and the Military Commissions Act. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth's conclusions are shared by thousands of scientists, senior-level military, intelligence, and government officials, pilots and aviation professionals, firefighters, scholars and university professors, 9/11 survivors and their family members, and other professionals around the world. Visit Patriots Question 9/11 Truth, patriotsquestion911.com, and Journal of 9/11 Studies as well. The 9/11 Truth movement, which Time magazine in 2006 called a mainstream political reality, continues to gain momentum. As AE 9/11 Truth's own influence grows, we have embarked on well over 130 speaking events covering 20 states and 13 countries, including most recently in Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. We would like to answer your questions now after these three very brief announcements. One, if you'd like to stay and hear the speakers during the luncheon, and you haven't yet purchased your luncheon ticket, I'll tell you we're sold out for the luncheon on the other side, but you can stay in this section. We'll remove the screen, and you'll be able to listen to the speakers, who include the same speakers plus several more that you haven't heard from yet. That luncheon begins at in about 10 minutes. If you would like to stay for the AE Strategy Conference from 2 to 6 p.m., which may more likely be 2:30 to 6 p.m., and have signed the AE 9/11 Truth petition, because this is for petition signers only, you may still register for this program out at our registration table. It's $30. We'll be reviewing the challenges of reaching additional professionals, academicians, government officials, and the public, as well as brainstorming future goals and strategies for AE 9/11 Truth, including growing it into the most well-managed professional organization that can handle the future demands of the massive publicity that we are expecting in 2010. Now, three, Dr. Jones will be giving a very special presentation in this room right here at 3 o'clock. That's going to be regarding the Haiti disaster. So if you're not joining us for the Architecture and Engineering mini-conference from 2:30 to 6, please join Dr. Jones here in the room. And I'll invite Dr. Jones, Dr. Griffin, and Eric Lawyer to come up, and we'll try to answer your questions. There is a microphone. John, I need the microphone here. Would you hand it not to this gentleman, but to the person